Today we're going to have a Jeremiah, if you will. I'm going to address how America became a prison state. I'm going to talk to you about how we became that way and how we might change that circumstance. But first, a little bit more about who the speaker is, whom Mike has just addressed. I come to you as a person that most people would think of as a right-wing Republican. As a teenager, I was the county chair for the most Republican county in the United States. Served 20 years as a United States Marine, and then after that as an assistant U.S. attorney. Personally, I have served as a prosecutor, a defense attorney, and as a judge in federal and state courts, but I am also, as an individual, a father of 4 sons and 6 daughters, a person who's never used drugs, never advocates the use of drugs, tells his children the same thing. But in my 25 years in the criminal justice system, in military courts, in federal courts, and in state courts, as a prosecutor, as a defense attorney, and as a judge, I'm here to tell you experientially, but you can also hear from the statistics. 716 of every 100,000 of our fellow citizens are currently now in jail. To give that a perspective, 4.4% of the world's population is in the United States, but 22% of those behind bars all over the world are behind bars here. You say that's just 1% incarceration, but that does not even include those who have been in jail who are not currently in jail, and those who are currently on probation with state court or on supervised release from federal courts. How did we get here? Well, it started with the 1970s with the war on drugs, trying to eradicate substance abuse, and then the 1980s with the so-called sentencing reform, first in federal courts and then in state courts. And even in the 1990s, as the crime rates dropped dramatically, as you can see from this chart, showing incarceration rates from 1925 to 2014, the rates rose first very greatly in the 1970s, even steeper in the 1980s, and then in the 1990s under President Clinton, it rose almost exponentially. What are the contributing factors to that? Well, we mentioned the war on drugs and the so-called tough-on-crime sentencing reform. But curiously enough, if you look at the studies of the major media outlets, they were heavily in favor, in our so-called liberal media, behind these very actions. And even as crime rates have gone down starting in the 1990s, we look to say, well, did it do any good? Well, the 2005 report of the Sentencing Project tells us that at best, 25% of the decline in violent crime is due to incarceration, which means the rest of it has to do with things like better community solutions, with better economic conditions created by more economic freedom. And curiously enough, states with lower rates of incarceration actually have greater decrease in rates of crime. And what is the harm of this? Well, certainly it's the emasculation of the family and the community, meaning removing men. The damage wrought by the Great Society programs of the left have been further exacerbated by the so-called tough-on-crime programs of the right. Prisons take men out of the economy. They create a Lord of Flies environment, if you've been in the prisons like I have. They create a whole class of feral men, and they take the responsibility for correcting misconduct from the family, from the church, and the community. Law enforcement has become a growth industry. More and more conduct is being criminalized, and law enforcement has become more militaristic to nowadays, they look like the infantry officers with whom I served, rather than those protecting their fellow citizens. There has been one great reduction, and that is your and my civil liberties under the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th Amendment. The war on drugs is directly responsible for this loss, and that the seizures of our property under so-called asset forfeiture. Like prohibition, the war on drugs has failed. It has produced no reduction in the use of drugs. Rather, we have had an increase in law enforcement and a reduction in their behavior. They look more and more like the violent criminals they're supposed to protect us from. I just spent the last several days at the Trial Lawyers College in Wyoming with this man, Pastor Darrell Burton, a Methodist minister in Kansas City, because I want you to see the face of the victims in that. That man spent 25 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit because his public defender was overworked and overloaded, and it took 25 years of writ work to get him exonerated. What can we do? Well, the obvious answer is reduce sentences. Find alternate means of correction other than putting them behind bars. But I consider also that you read about it yourself. Don't take my word for it. And I suggest your first book ought to be one of my mentors, trial lawyer Jerry Spence's book, The Police State. Read it yourself. And I hope you'll see as I have, that we need to change and stop America from becoming a prison state. Thank you.